We need to talk about the Milwaukee Bucks. So in my last video, I talked about the most disappointing teams in the NBA, and in the comment section, quite a few of you all pointed out how underwhelming Milwaukee has been all season long. Now, to be fair to the Bucks, I don't think they're the top 4 most disappointing teams in the league, and I don't even think they're top 5. However, it is still very important to note what's going on in Milwaukee, because over the past 10 games or so, it doesn't seem as if it's getting better, and I truly believe there's a lot, and I do mean a lot of legitimate concerns that's going on with this organization. I say this because of an underwhelming record that has placed Milwaukee 5th in the Eastern Conference and has gotten worse over the last 10 games, a meeting that has hinted to this idea that this team really doesn't have any true identity yet, even though we are this deep into the regular season. And news recently just broke that Damian Lillard is going to be sidelined indefinitely, more than likely missing a good portion of whatever is rest of the regular season. So yeah, it's really, really bad. As I record this video, the Milwaukee Bucks have a record of 40-31, which is only good enough to be the 5th seed in the Eastern Conference. Be very mindful that heading into the season, many people assume that the Bucks are going to have a top 3 to 4 seed in the East and separate themselves from the pack, but here they are. Milwaukee is right in the middle, in the thick of things, of going from a playoff team to potentially sliding all the way in the play-in. The thing that sticks out even further is offensively, they are only 13th in the NBA, something that certainly should not have occurred from a team that has a duo in both Dame and Giannis, but we'll touch upon that later. And in particular, over the last 10 games, they have a record of 4-6, which raised a level of concern so high that both Giannis and Dame sat down with head coach Doc Rivers, and they had a discussion, an open dialogue about how certain things could be changed, which was reported by Chris Haynes. Quick sidebar, love you, Chris Haynes. You know, I inspire to be where you're at in your career, but let's just call a spade a spade. If there was a meeting with Giannis, Dame, and Doc Rivers, and Chris Haynes reported on it, hey, brother, you might as well say, this what Dame told me. You might as well say that, because that ain't no surprise. Nevertheless, though, it is very, very interesting to see how much this team is trying to still pick up the pieces this deep into the season, how they still don't have the chemistry and continuity on their side to where we're heading into the playoffs. And even with an underwhelming record, I think a lot of people still would have anticipated for them to be a little bit more dominant than where they are right now, but it still hasn't manifested to that whatsoever. And in my opinion, what's even more concerning is how they look against other really good teams in the NBA. Shout out to NBA University. They actually put out a graphic on their timeline talking about how, what do these teams look like against above 500 teams versus losing teams or teams with losing records. And everyone, for the past month and some change, have been talking about the New York Knicks and their inability to win against competent teams, or at least some of the better teams at the top of the conference, because they have a record of 11-17 against above 500 teams. But now that people are talking about the fact that the Milwaukee Bucks are right there with them, if not worse, because they have a record of 11-18. Now, of course, there are several contributing factors to how we got to this result, many of which we talked about in the beginning part of the season. I was attempting to be very, very kind and optimistic about what the Bucks looked like back in November, early in the season. Didn't want to overreact too much, but here we are, and these problems have been fairly consistent themes all season long. The team doesn't have any athleticism defensively when guarding POAs. Taurean Prince and Gary Trent Jr., they're not going to cut it when trying to stand in front of quick, shifty guards out there in the Eastern Conference. This team also lacks the bench depth, which is something that a lot of people probably knew was going to happen, at least take a hit to the talent on the roster, because when you trade for Dame, you lose some of that financial flexibility, so it's harder for you to retain talent on your team. But it got really, really bad early on when we saw the regression of Bobby Portis, and now that he's no longer playing for the team for the last 25 games of the season because of an anti-drug policy. Apparently, he was abusing some substance. Who knows? I don't think that there's some validity behind it. But hey, man, you didn't pass the piss test, so it is what it is. So that's made that problem even worse. And you can certainly put some of the blame at the feet of Doc Rivers. I do find it pretty hilarious that last year, some of the narratives or news or some of the leaks of information that came out is that Doc was trying to give some guidance to Adrian Griffin, and some of the guidance that he gave him was, hey, man, you got to do more two-man game with Dame and Giannis. You got to do that. And then Doc got the job, and he also didn't do any two-man game last year. And even this year, there's still not that much two-man game. At the end of the games, there still isn't any execution between Dame and Giannis. So that's also a problem. And you can certainly say, hey, the lack of games played between the two stars, especially now at the tail end of the season where Dame is going to be out, that has also been a major problem for the team as well. But Bro, we just gotta say it. We gotta say it, bro. The Dame and Giannis duo, this experiment has been a massive failure. They just don't mesh well with one another. They don't have that much synergy, and it's not working out. Be very mindful that the whole idea, the theory of having Dame and Giannis on the same roster was, hey man, even though we're going to lose financial flexibility, even though we're going to lose depth because we don't have the means to keep the talent on the roster, and even though we're going to lose a lot of our defensive identity after losing Jrue Holiday, and crazy enough, also giving our rival team, the Boston Celtics, the means in which to make a competent team to go on and win a championship because now they have Jrue. Even though all these things could happen and did happen and will continue to happen, our offense and the duo of Dame and Giannis are going to be so overwhelming that none of it is really going to matter, right? And so that's pretty high standards and a high bar for what you expect out of this duo. Now, last year, people gave a lot of grace. People were still optimistic, right? Because Dame was having an uncharacteristic season. No one did not believe that version of Dame is who he truly was going to be. And then, he also wasn't in full health and full shape because allegedly to Doc Rivers, he was afraid of getting injured in the offseason. And so we gave a lot of grace to Dame there. Gave a lot of grace to Brook Lopez, who didn't look like himself. Chris Middleton also was coming back from injuries. He was trying to find his way and play alongside this team in a new role, right? A lot of grace was given. But this year, that grace just isn't there because there isn't any more excuses to be made. Dame, so far this season, he's playing significantly better than he did last year. Now, it's nowhere near close to where it was back in Portland, but I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's just aging. He's getting older. He doesn't have the same burst explosiveness, but that shouldn't really be that much of a problem because there is another threat in the front court that you've never had to the degree of a Giannis Antetokounmpo. So the level of spacing that you should have should be there to make up for whatever you are lacking in terms of foot speed and athleticism. Even with the improvement of Dame, this is still a problem. And then when it comes to Giannis, a lot of people were very critical of who Giannis was as a player because they deem he's not as portable. He's someone who doesn't have a jump shot. He's only getting to the basket. So there's an issue there with Giannis. And also his level of skill hasn't really improved. However, I personally believe the last 2 years as a passer and playmaker, he has seen noticeable improvements. But more importantly, this year, Giannis went from someone who had no game outside of like 10 feet from the basket to being one of the best mid-range scorers in the NBA in total. Like if you compare Giannis's numbers in the mid-range, and I'm not just talking about accuracy, also volume as well, Giannis has quickly became one of the greatest mid-range scorers in the NBA this season. And it's absurd when you stop and really think about it because that was a flaw in his game this entire time. So the fact that Giannis has improved in those regards and Dame has improved immensely from that off season that he had last year, and we're still getting these results, it's very, very concerning. And a lot of it clearly has to do with the fact that there isn't enough chemistry, continuity, and synergy between the two stars, something that a lot of people like myself, we thought was going to be a bit of a concern when the news broke that during the offseason, Giannis and Dame didn't really get together to work alongside one another, practice in the offseason. That was concerning, but hey, what do we know? We're just fans. We don't know enough about what's going on. Maybe, you get on the floor, things start to clicking, right? But that certainly still hasn't happened. And here we are now. And for whatever reason, this team still at the end of games or during stretches when they're struggling to score, when Giannis and Dame on the floor, they still do not default into a two-man game with Giannis and Dame. That's just not being seen enough whatsoever. It still feels as if like this team is just taking turns between Giannis and Dame, one possession after another. And what is really eye-opening to the level of impact that we're seeing from Giannis and Dame this year in contrast to previous iterations of Giannis-led Milwaukee Bucks teams is the on-off numbers between Giannis and Dame and Giannis and Jrue Holiday. Because again, theory is that even though defensively there's going to be a slip, offensively there's going to be such a high ceiling that it was going to make up for the lack of defensive presence, but that's just not being seen at all. Going back to the 21 campaign, when Jrue Holiday and Giannis were on the floor with one another, the Bucks had an offensive rating of around 120, a defensive rating around 108, and a net rating that was 11-12, a positive net rating, very clear. And when you get to plus 12 net rating, you are entering or at least near the stratosphere of all-time great status. However, compare that to what we're seeing this year, which is a theory, the best iteration of a Dame and Giannis duo, and it's just not yielding that many different results offensively. The offensive rating when Dame and Giannis are on the floor this year, offensive rating of 121, very impressive, but not too much of a difference from what we saw with Jrue Holiday and Giannis. And then of course the defensive rating is certainly different, so that only yields you a net rating of 8, which is still pretty good, but nowhere near close to where we were at back in 2021. Now, to be fair, when it comes to on-off numbers, I've said this before, there's a lot of lineup data that you have to look into, and back in 2021, Chris Middleton was playing some of the best basketball he was playing in his career. Brook Lopez was younger, Bobby Portis was better. The overall supporting cast was better back then than where we are right now, and I'm pretty sure they had a much bigger contributing factor than Jrue Holiday, who is, objectively speaking, a worse offensive player than where Dame is at right now. That still wasn't the point, because again, we knew that was going to be a problem. We knew that as Chris Middleton continued to age, that he was not going to be able to be the same player that he once was, and that was even further pointed to the fact that when he dealt with an injury and sustaining them constantly and struggling to stay on the floor, that we were never going to get that version of Chris Middleton again. Brook Lopez getting older, Bobby Portis also getting older, the lack of depth and continuity around the team was going to drop because, again, you didn't have that much same financial flexibility. And so for the result to still give you around a 120 offensive rating kind of does beg the question, was the idea, the gamble of leveraging depth for star name or talent in your duo, was it worth it? Because it certainly doesn't feel that way, because even back then, they were still getting to an offensive rating that was around 120, peaking at all-time highs, even without an all-time great passer, playmaker, shot creator in someone like Damian Lillard. And if that wasn't enough to make you a believer that the Damian Lillard experiment really wasn't working out for you, well, looking at even more on-off numbers exclusively to Dame, it kind of furthers a point that the level of impact that we're seeing from Dame on this team, it just isn't there. When Dame is on the floor this season, they have an offensive rating of 115, a defensive rating of around 115 as well, which gives the Bucks a net rating that is fairly neutral. But when he's off the floor, they have an offensive rating of 109.5, which is a noticeable drop, but defensively they improve to 105, which gives them a net rating of 4.5, meaning that the Bucks are indeed a better team when Dame is not on the floor, which is really, really telling. This is actually so alarming. Not only when my team brought this information to me, I was like, I don't believe it. Maybe there was a mistake. So I did my own due diligence, dug a little bit further. And not only is this information true, I was like, you know what? On-off numbers, like I always tell you, there's a lot of noise with the on-off numbers, right? There's a lot of digging you have to do with the lineup data, right? So I did a little bit more digging. I was like, hey man, maybe there's certain players that they're putting on the floor with Dame that is yielding this type of results. And I want to make sure that maybe it's not just Dame. Maybe everybody is like this, but no. No. It's just Dame. When you look at the defensive rating from everyone that receives any noteworthy minutes on this team, when they're on the floor, it's just better than Dame's. Again, when Dame is on the floor, the Bucks defensive rating is around 115. Giannis is 111. Andre Jackson 111. Brook Lopez 111. Bobby Portis 111. And when they're off the floor, all of their numbers are relatively similar to when they're on the floor, except for Dame's, where there is a noticeable improvement. That is effectively a 10-point swing defensively in favor of the Bucks when Dame is off the floor. That is absurd. Now, I did a little bit more digging. I was like, man, maybe there's someone on the team that has a similar on-off defensive rating in contrast to Dame. And I did find two players, both Taurean Prince and Gary Trent Jr. When both of them are on the floor, the Bucks have a defensive rating of 113 to 114. And when they're off the floor, it does take a somewhat noticeable swing in the opposite direction. So that's very interesting. However, when I was doing my due diligence with this video and my research, I started to quickly notice when I'm watching the games, there is a lot of lineups where Dame exists alongside Gary Trent Jr. and Taurean Prince, which makes a lot of sense because if they don't do that, then there's really not going to be any defensive resistance on the perimeter whatsoever. So they surround Dame with quality defenders on that makes sense. And that could also mean the defensive rating when Gary Trent Jr. and Taurean Prince are on the floor are being massively influenced by the fact that they just share a lot of minutes with Damian Lillard rather than their actual impact. So of course, I then did a little bit more digging with some of the numbers, and that's true as well. That's true. When Gary Trent Jr., Taurean Prince, and Damian Lillard are on the floor with one another, offensive rating of 119, defensive rating of 121, which yields a negative net rating. However, when Taurean Prince and Gary Trent Jr. are on the floor without Dame, offensive rating basically stays the same, and their defensive rating improves all the way to a 110, which yields a net rating of nearly 9. So yeah, it's just a Dame problem. And I hate to be that guy. It's a fact. Like, even when you watch Dame play defense, he is really, really, really bad on that side of the floor. You just have to have a roster to piece around him to really make up for whatever he's giving up on that side of the ball. And unfortunately, when he's making the amount of money in which he's making alongside Giannis, you no longer have the financial flexibility to make the necessary improvements around the team so you can hide Dame as much as possible, because he's really that bad. And yes, it is true that Chris Middleton, his regression, and then in turn receiving Kyle Kuzma certainly didn't help them out. And within a small amount of games in which Kuzma's played, he too has a negative net rating when he's on the floor. So again, that did not help out this team whatsoever. That's really the only type of improvements that they could make, or at least alterations that they can make at this point of the season, because more than likely they're going to have to make these type of improvements in the offseason once more. But again, the amount of money that Dame and Giannis are making, these are going to be marginal improvements around the edges, nothing really massive or any significant improvements. And while that is occurring, Brook Lopez is going to get older again. I actually believe Brook Lopez is coming off of his contract, so he's going to be a free agent either this upcoming offseason, if not the next. So then you're going to end up losing one of your more defensive-oriented personnel pieces. And even if you bring him back, Brook Lopez just isn't the same player that he was before. He's certainly nowhere near close to the DPOY level player that he was about 3 or 4 years ago. So I don't really know if this team can really make the necessary improvements to make up for whatever they are lacking defensively, because it's way more than people originally believed when it came to Damian Lillard, while also still not receiving the type of results you would want to see from Giannis and Dame when they are on the floor on the offensive side of the floor. And again, I don't want to be that guy and be like, oh, it's only a matter of time before Giannis leaves. But it may be only a matter of time before Giannis leaves, bro. It does feel like we're heading in that direction, because there's not that many more options or moves that can be made. But hey, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comment section below. If you missed my last video, make sure you click it somewhere around here. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.